Welcome to Strategic Growth Council, a podcast about strategic growth and mergers and acquisitions for the middle market. If you are interested in learning more about organic growth, growth by acquisition, or the sale of your company, this show will be interesting or useful, or maybe both for you. Thanks to our sponsors, Aclaro Growth Partners, a strategy consulting firm serving middle market mergers and acquisitions. You can visit aclaropartners.com. Our other sponsor, of course, is Strategic Growth Council, not the podcast, but the peer advisory council / virtual roundtable / mastermind group for senior execs and business owners contemplating what? A acquisition, a sale, or just strategic growth. Strategic Growth Council collaborates with participants in the M&A ecosystem, such as private equity groups, lenders, investment banks, and relevant service providers. Visit strategicgrowthcouncil.com to learn more. Now, every episode, I interview an expert, or at least a participant, in the world of strategy, growth, or mergers and acquisitions. And today, I'm joined by Debrah Young of Sheer Velocity, a global retained executive search firm focusing on the lower middle market with connections in private equity. Talent, obviously, is hard to retain and to recruit for today. So very relevant. Debrah, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Kit. It's great to be here too. Appreciate the invite.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to this topic, and I'm sure our listeners will get a lot out of it because, as I said, it's a relevant topic. So yeah, maybe if you could just take 30 to 60 seconds in terms of a background on yourself, that would be great.
Sure. So I've been doing executive recruiting for almost 20 years now. I'm actually a music major by trade in college, but ended up through the course of the way life leads us into different directions, finally into executive recruiting, and started out opening up a office for a boutique firm. Did that for 4.5 years, built that business here in Denver, and then got recruited to a top 5 global firm at the time. That is where I met my business partner. We worked together for close to 4 years, I think it was, before we left and started our own firm in 2012, Sheer Velocity. And we are now listed in Huntscallen, which is actually the largest single source of information in the human capital space, as one of the top PE recruiting Power 100 firms in the country.
That's great.
Years.
That's great. Mm-hmm. Well, congratulations on that. And I'm going to take a little bit of a left-hand turn and back up to music major in college. Do you play any instruments today?
I haven't touched my flute. That was my major. I can play piano. I kind of live through my son, who's a phenomenal musician and has a band. So.
Oh, wow. Fantastic.
Yeah,
wonderful.
But no, it really formulated large part of my life and how I manage my work is, there's a lot of transferable skills, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, what you do is probably equal parts art and science, and at least the art aspect. I mean, music is art and science, so it is relevant. So our listeners are, as I said earlier, focused on organic growth and acquisitions, divestitures, sales of businesses. And as you said, you're listed as one of the top resources for private equity groups. How does your work tie into mergers and acquisitions?
Sure. So we do work in all 3 areas: organic growth, M&A, divestitures, and sale of businesses. So we're often brought in if a PE firm is looking to they bought a new company, they're looking to swap out the founder, owner, CEO, which usually happens sometimes within a course of either a year or 2. And then, they flip and bring in a CEO to help grow the company, which is a very different individual than someone that we would place in a mergers and acquisitions scenario, for example. I mean, like, your CFO is a very specific talent in M&A. They have, they have to understand deals potential risks and due diligence process and all of those things. So understanding where the company is at and what kind of driver is going on, whether it's organic M&A, divestiture, different skill set of talent at the leadership level is needed. And if, as a search firm, we're able to identify and understand the skill sets for all three of those.
Yeah, and I just want to add maybe a point of clarification on the acquisition front. I never really thought about this before, but any sense of how frequently a private equity group already has a successor in mind? I mean, when does the search for a new CEO take place? It's, as you said, it's quite common for that founder, owner, the family dynasty to remain in place for some period of time, and then there's a transition that occurs. How often is the successor already sort of planned out in advance?
Well, it depends on, one of the things that we tell people that own businesses, say a family-owned business, you need to plan ahead your leadership talent team several years before you sell your company, because you need to have them in place in order to, get the best return on the sale of your company. So you need to have strong leadership talent. And lots of times that talent will then stay on. To be honest with you, the huge turnover that's going on in the market right now. I mean, it's very volatile, and CEOs are hopped on the bandwagon, the boom of trying to find greener pastures. So as of right now, the fill rate for a private equity firm for CEOs can be up to 73% over the course of the life of the PE firm. So there's a lot of turnover going on. So buying a business that has a stable leadership team already, I think really is to your advantage. And then maybe a year down the road, swap out to bring in someone who can take that organization to the next level.
Yeah, and Debrah, we talked about this.
Sorry.
We talked about this the very first time you and I spoke, but it's been a while, and I'm sort of curious, and maybe I should have led with this question. This is the Great Resignation, right? So and as you said, this carries over all the way up to the CEO level. C-level executives are actively looking for new opportunities. We've never really experienced a period like this before in human capital. Is this a great time to be in your position, or is it a really, really challenging period for you? Or is it both?
It's a little bit of both. I will tell you, though, we have such deep roots within our firm and in our networks of everyone within the firm in all different industries, that we have this very rich database of contacts. If you don't have that and you just put up a shingle and say, I'm going to go recruit, you're going to have challenge finding candidates. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people out there, but there aren't, if that makes any sense. There's a lot of people who are looking to move, but they're moving for the wrong reasons, and they're really not the right ones to be hiring for a position or have the right motives for being not, I shouldn't say for looking, but for that particular role. So it's a very good market for recruiters right now. We're, seeing record numbers in the number of searches that are being executed on. But if you don't already have a deep, rich network, you're going to struggle finding talent.
Yeah. You talked about this deep, rich network, and I wonder, is that your primary differentiator? And if not, what is? How do you differentiate in today's market?
Sure. That's one of the things that differentiate us for sure. But the other thing too is, PE firms right now, number one priority for them is in the wake of COVID is there's this transformative shift that's happening in Their emphasis has new drivers right now. They are on culture, diversity, and DEI and engagement. Um, so their aim is to find new sustainable ways to enhance value, I guess, growth, results, and returns. So they're falling short, though, on getting the right talent into the right roles. And part of that reason is they're moving too slowly.
Mm-hmm.
So our firm, Sheer Velocity, Speed with Transparency, we look at candidates from a complete 360-degree perspective, utilizing some proprietary tools that we have in our tool belt that get not only at technical skill sets deeper than the resume and interviewing, but also cultural fit, culture add, because every leader has a certain belief system or value system that they emanate whenever they're in an organization. And if it's not in alignment with the current leadership team, there's going to be that rub there. So then, there's that cultural piece. And then there's the leadership personality piece. How do they perform under stress? What are their derailers? What are their bright sides? And so if you look at our search process in that 360-degree view, utilizing strong data-driven tool sets, or tools, I should say, assessments or whatever, in conjunction with deep dive interviewing, behavior interviewing, really, focusing up front for technical fit. I will tell you that's really where the search process just starts, is when you find a technical skill set. From there, what's more important are the people skills at the leadership level. And private equity firms are starting to recognize this and realize that, because at the end of the day, you want engagement out of your people, because when you have engagement and leaders that lead with emotional intelligence, when you have engagement, that's when the magic happens in an organization.
Absolutely. So you said a lot there. I'm going to try to summarize for our listeners. I mean, you've got the toolbox, you've got the skills, you've got the quality of interviewing, the network. You went into some detail describing ways that you differentiate, and you also mentioned diversity, equity, and inclusion, and kind of led me to think about this conversation from the viewpoint of the listener, right? So if you're running a business, or if you're on the board, or you own a business, and you're considering using an executive recruiter or executive search firm, what should you be thinking about? What should you be considering when you're evaluating service providers? It's not just those differentiators that you rattled off, but I'd say, you mentioned DEI. Where does that fit into the strategic objectives of that particular business? For example, does it start with big picture goals? I guess it depends on the level of the recruit, right? That was a bit of a muddled question, Deborah. I'm sorry. I mean,
I think I got it. I think when you're looking for an executive search firm, and particularly in the private equity space, there's a couple things that you really need to focus on. One thing I do have to say, and DEI is another thing, but everybody hones in on the deep industry experience that you have, the industry that the organization, their products and services. You got to look a little bit deeper, because you can hire an executive search firm that is, all they do is a certain industry, but they don't talk about the blockage problems that comes with being so niche. Because when you can't recruit from your clients, and when everyone in your niche is your client, where do you go to find your talent? So our firm, we've kept pretty much industry agnostic. And so we are able to go into companies that some of these niche search firms can't touch. Mm-hmm. So that's number one. Credibility and connections is very important. We have a 93% success fill rate, a 92% client satisfaction, and a 90% repeat clientele base. So we've learned to develop really strong relationships, and our capability to grow with organizations, with PE firms, and do work in multiple portfolio companies is really important. You have to have full transparency in the talent search process, which we do by getting back to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I do want to say this. I think at the end of the day, you can try to really have a mandate of having, so many diverse people, leaders in your organization. But if you are doing it just to check off the box, you're doing it with the wrong motive. And so you want to do it so that it's the right thing for the organization, and not just to say you have this percentage of diverse candidates on your team. The thing is if you put a diverse candidate into a role where they may not really have a good chance of succeeding, it's not only disruptive and expensive to your organization when you have to replace them, you also are in a way, quote, derailing their career path, because that's not fair to them either.
And that's a really good point. And I've experienced this firsthand with you, and your experience and wisdom and your willingness to push back and say, well, let's think about the big picture. Very helpful. And, something else that you mentioned, you talked about capabilities and relationships and credibility and transparency. You also mentioned industry agnosticity, if that's a word. And in reality, I mean, people might hold that against you being industry agnostic, but the truth of the matter is when your focus is on the lower middle market, you don't really have a choice, because there's so many obscure niche sub segments that it's impossible to say, this is the industry that we focus upon. To some extent, you've chosen private equity as an industry, and by definition, that involves a number of different weird, obscure, niche sub-segments of big industries. So I get it.
Yeah, we get those calls.
I'm curious about whether there's a success story that you could share with our group that might be enlightening, sort of a case example, particularly one that relates to growth or merger and acquisition activity.
Sure.
I think that helps kind of where the rubber hits the road as an example.
Sure. I'm going to leave company name out because they're clients, but we have a client in Indiana in a very small town, and I think it was in 2015 we placed 5 executives, including a president of a new division of a $100 million PE-backed company, and they were in a pretty niche space, so there weren't a lot of competitors to recruit talent from, and plus we had to relocate 5 executives to this small town in Indiana. So right there out of the gate, you've got huge challenges. We put all 5 candidates through our search process, which, like I mentioned, 360-degree view, certain tools that we use in order to make better fits. Information is power. Doing your due diligence, dotting your I's, crossing your T's, taking your time to make the right hire, and our client did. So all 5 executives are still there. The company just bought a $1 billion organization to add to the company. Wow. And they were bought. Now they were public, and now they went private again by a very large investing PE firm.
That's great. Well, that is a good story. How long ago was it that you initially did the search for them?
2015.
Oh, I think you said that. Yeah, good.
I believe it was 15 or 16. But over the course of a year and a half, we filled 5 very key roles, and I know that the president got promoted to the holding company president, so there was a lot of promotions. And I do have to say that I talked with their HR director 2 years after all those searches were done, and everybody was still there. And I asked her, I said, so what do you think of the 5 people that, you guys ended up hiring that we helped place? And she said, I just want you to know that I know what they're going to do before they do it. The information that you provided us about these candidates was so thorough and so accurate about behavior, culture fit. She says, it's just been a true blessing to be able to have had that insight and that knowledge in order to help guide and develop their careers within the organization and their teams.
Yeah, so that was a good story for sure, and it's only fair, I think, and interesting and fun to kind of flip the tables on you and ask for an example of a situation that did not go well. But before we do that, you and I haven't talked about this before, but I am just curious. Today, if you're a head of HR in, your example was $100 million revenue business, but even if we went all the way down to say a 15 or $20 million revenue business, my question is, there's so many tools available to HR directors to do executive search all by themselves. And my question is, are you seeing an increase in competition from essentially your client base trying to do it themselves? Or has that time come and they've learned some lessons and realized, well, it just didn't work out the way we'd hoped. We need to go back to somebody like Sheer Velocity. Is that a fair question, Debrah?
I think it is. I think, okay, take into account the last, 2+ years since
Right.
March of 2020. And HR had to just really step up. And so I think they have learned to appreciate the value of having a good search partner and the ability to look outside of the organization while they're busy trying to create a safe place for these people to work, and all the other nuances and dynamics that go along with being an HR leader besides recruiting. Take that off their plate. They've just been, and I think the last 2 years have made that even more apparent. And the fact that having a third party, unbiased individual or team looking out in the marketplace for you is really critical. The other thing that I really like about a good HR leader is their bench strength. And if they've got people, lined up. Private equity, that's a little bit harder. You're not a big, large organization where you have, several layers to pull from throughout, the course of a person's career. So a lot of that work has to go outside. And believe it or not, it's a busy process, and it's a time-consuming process, and it's building relationships with people, getting their trust, selling your company, your client's company in a positive manner so that they feel comfortable and excited about an opportunity.
And I realize we didn't talk about this previously, but I'm just curious, and I want to add a kind of a follow-on to what you just said. So hypothetically, a private equity group is your client and they own a portfolio company, and maybe they just lost their CFO at portfolio company number 7. Is it the private equity group that is your client, and do they lead the process? Is it the portfolio company CEO or head of HR? Is it both? Is it all over the map?
It's all over. We get hired by the portfolio company. We have a search. We place a CFO that we got hired by the PE firm for a smaller Denver-based company just this last year. And now we are doing their head of business development and sales. And at that part, the PE firm is not as involved in as the CFO is that we just placed. So we work at many levels. Throughout there, we have a client that, their HR, the PE firm's HR leader, oversees some of the searches along with the portfolio company. So we've done a lot of different scenarios.
Yeah.
But, it really is about how you develop your relationship with your client, whether it be the PE firm, whether it be the portfolio company level. It's
Yep.
just...
And you have to maintain connections and credibility with all of the above. I get it. So that makes sense. Now back to the case example, because this is fun. I'd love to hear a story about something that went awry or amiss and what happened.
Sure. So we use the Hogan assessment. I'm certified in Hogan, and Hogan is the only leadership personality assessment on the market that's designed for the selection of leadership talent. So I've been using Hogan for 20 years. We use it for when we get to the end of a search, when we have our top 3 candidates for, I really don't care how many it is. And it's the number one predictor of behavior in the workplace. So we had a search where it was a very niche company. There was maybe 3 people in the nation that did what these guys wanted to do, and we were able to engage with this individual to get them on board. And then and the client fell in love with them, wanted to hire them instantly, but we still needed to put them through the Hogan. We put them through the Hogan, and I will tell you, this person should never be in a leadership role. That's all I'll say.
Can you give us not a literal example, but what would be a reason that you would assess them that way? They should not be in a leadership role.
They would create a toxic culture through their behaviors, their boldness, their excitability, their skepticism, all these other traits that are identified in the Hogan. I counseled my client not to hire this individual. As hard as it was to find them, at the end of the day, this was a president position, and this person really should just be an individual contributor.
Yeah, interesting.
And not even 6 months later, I got the call. We let him go. You have to redo the search.
Yeah, well, you called it, and the good news is that demonstrated their trust in you, but also your knowledge of your craft, and you did it in a delicate enough way that presumably it wasn't in your face. I told you so. So that's good. That's a good story. And so any other, sometimes, and there may not be, but sometimes our guests have some other wisdom or insights or lessons learned that didn't come out in the natural course of this conversation. Anything else that you'd like to share for our listeners?
Well, one of the things that's really critical, especially with this challenge of getting candidates, is to always have, at least 2 people ready to step into the role. Because if one doesn't pan out, I had a candidate who was ready, to sign the offer letter, and I got a call the night before saying they didn't want to move because their wife didn't want to leave their book club. So, you can only vet people so far. At the end of the day, people are not widgets, and they will do what they want to do. As much as you try to predict behavior and outcomes for your client, clients that don't understand that being in the people business, it's not a guaranteed. It's not guaranteed that ball bearing is going to last, 500 million miles on that car. You can't guarantee this person's going to stay for, 5 years. You can do your best, and that's what we're good at. But it's interesting when you're dealing with people, and getting back to that original point about having, a stable of candidates, because you never know if someone's going to pull at the last minute, and you don't want to be starting from scratch again. Your client doesn't want you to be starting from scratch again. So as hard as it is right now in this tough candidate market, if clients like someone, they need to move quickly.
Yes, absolutely.
That's advice.
Not only move quickly, but as you said, have backups. And I will add my key takeaway from this conversation. I never thought about this before, but it's fascinating. As I come from the world of consulting, and we always talk about it's a people business, but and it's a service business, and you can be really, really good at what you do. But at the end of the day, your service business is not about a deliverable. It's about a person that can make a decision that completely throws a wrench into the works. And I thought that was really interesting the way you described that. You can go through the process and use best practices and be very good at what you've done and find the right person and negotiate. And then at the end of the day, they can just sort of change their mind. So that shows our listeners, I think, or demonstrates the value in having a pipeline, having backups and trusted relationships on an ongoing basis. So that makes sense. So Sheer Velocity, a global retained executive search firm that serves this world that we live in, the ecosystem of middle market mergers and acquisitions. Debrah, how can our listeners find you? What's the website?
Sure, it's www.sheervelocity, that's SHEER, velocity, VELOCITY.com.
Great. And I always ask, is there anything we can do to help you? How can we or our listeners support Sheer Velocity?
Sure. If you have any talent needs, obviously, we'd be welcome to go over that with you. I will tell you one thing about our firm is we're not afraid to say, you know what, we're not the right ones for you to fill that position, because if we don't feel we're going to be set up for success, it doesn't do anyone any good. Your client doesn't do any good. It doesn't do any good for our firm. So I think it's just really important to be, that honest and that transparent as a search firm, because you can take people's companies' money and know that you're not going to be able to do the work as good as you could. So I also want to mention one other thing too. Our global affiliation in NOC, Global Executive Search, has been rated a top 40 global executive search firm for 3 years in a row. And we've been the sole U.S. partner for them for the last going on 9 years. So we refer and exchange business in 35 countries around the world. So if any of your clients need any help opening offices across the country, or have offices that, may need some leadership talent, please feel free to reach out and we can make those connections as well for you.
And was that ENOC? Is that the acronym?
INAC, INAC.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's good. I actually thought of a client that I'll introduce to you shortly. Thank you, Debrah.
No.
So, Debrah, Sheer Velocity, keep her in mind. But and in addition to Debrah, thank you very much for your time and your input. This was a fun conversation. In addition to Sheer Velocity, please think of our sponsors, Aclaro Growth Partners, a growth strategy consulting firm serving the middle market of mergers and acquisitions, and strategicgrowthcouncil.com, which is we run peer advisory councils for C-level executives and business owners. Follow us at strategicgrowthcouncil.com to find other past episodes, and please do review us, click on a rating, and thanks for listening.
This podcast was produced by Heartcast Media.